Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you can hear me. Welcome to the second webinar of the Continuous Cover Forestry Group's 2023 to 24 webinar series. My name's Bill Mason. I'm the chair of the CCFG, and I'll be acting as the moderator today. It's a pleasure today to welcome someone I've been trying to get to speak in these webinars for quite a while, my friend and colleague, Gary Kerr, but Gary had to retire before we could persuade him that it was appropriate for him to be giving a webinar. I don't intend to say very much about Gary's career because I'm sure he's well known to most people on this call. Gary was Forest Research's principal silviculturalist for a number of years until he retired a month or so ago. He has both national and international research experience in the area of continuous cover forestry, and he's published a number of major and important papers on continuous cover forestry related topics, including description of the long-running trial at Glen Tress near Peebles. He's also helped to author or been the senior author on a number of technical guidelines on continuous cover forestry. And lastly, which is a measure of his international eminence, he was for a number of years the chair of the International Union of Forest Research Organizations working group on uneven age silviculture. So Gary, really great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon. Look forward to hearing your webinar. Over to you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Bill, for that very kind introduction. And without further ado, we'll get on with the presentation. Ooh. Can everybody see the presentation?
You maybe want to click it to go to full screen, Gary.
Yeah. Just to get it going. Can everybody? Oh no, hold on a minute. Yeah, there's one thing that we just need to do on that. Where was that? Can everybody see that?
That's the presenter mode. You want the full the other part of PowerPoint.
How do I switch it? Oh,
I think you need to stop sharing and maybe go back or something.
Yeah.
not share.
So
Share screen.
that's it.
Well done.
You can
Thanks,
see that.
Gary.
Is that okay with everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. That's great. Okay, let's get underway then. So this webinar, we're asking the question, how can silvicultural systems help adapt forests to climate change? And I'd just like to acknowledge right from the outset that this is largely based on a piece of work that I did with my colleague Victoria Stokes some years ago, but many of the findings are still very pertinent. And I thought it was important to draw upon that for this webinar. Along the way, I will also be saying a few words about silvicultural systems and the communication of those sorts of ideas within forestry practice in the UK. So the first sort of slide then is... Okay, so the structure of the presentation. First of all, I'm going to say a little bit about silvicultural systems, high forest ones, and talk a little bit about examples of application. And then I'm just going to give a summary and give some of my views about communication. And then there's a cheeky question, which I'm going to ask. There's a multiple choice question. I'll ask you to write down the answer on a piece of paper and then tell you what the answer is. And then the format's very much the same for the second, perhaps longer part of the presentation, which is about climate change. And I'm going to describe 5 primary risks of climate change and talk about the evidence that we found in a literature review that we did on this subject, as I said, a few years ago. Then I'll offer a summary of that. And there'll be another cheeky question where, once again, I'll be asking a question. There'll be 4 answers, and you'll write down your answer on a piece of paper, and then I'll tell you what the answer is, and we can have a chat about that. And then right at the end, we'll talk about some take-home messages. Okay, so let's get on with it. The first thing is, what are silvicultural systems? They're very nicely defined in the classic work by Troop, 1928. A silvicultural system may be defined as the process by which the crops constituting a forest are tended, removed, and replaced by new crops, resulting in the production of woods of a distinctive form. So there are elements there of regeneration, there are elements there of tending, and the way in which you intervene basically produces woods that have a distinctive form. And there are distinctive types of system. The first part of the talk, I'll be saying more about those different types of silvicultural systems. But of course, the main one that we know about in this country is clear felling. And clear felling is a legitimate silvicultural system. It's very good for achieving certain management objectives, but it is one of the main silvicultural systems. Okay, so this rather helpful decision diagram, decision tree, helps us to differentiate different types of silvicultural systems. The first question right at the top that we have to answer is felling and regeneration A concentrated on part of the forest area? If it is, then you go down the left-hand side, the A side of this decision tree. If it's continuous over the whole area, you go down the right-hand decision tree, and it's a selection system. And in terms of this presentation, it's worth remembering what that question is. That's a hint. And so if we go down the left-hand side, the next question that we have to answer, if we want to classify silvicultural systems, is the old crop cleared by a single felling? If it is, you go down the A side, down the left side, and that gives you clear felling. If it's successive regeneration fellings, you go down the right-hand side, the B side, and that leads you to the shelterwood systems. And there's 3 of those. And depending on how the canopy and how quickly the canopy is opened, you've either got a uniform system, a group system, or an irregular system. And one of the important things about terminology is that I'll also be using in this presentation alternatives to clear felling and continuous cover. I think they're more or less synonymous terms. And the point about this decision tree is that the further to the right you are, the more likely you are to be achieving conditions of continuous cover or alternatives to clear felling. Okay, so just a brief review then of the main silvicultural systems. We have the uniform shelterwood system. This is commonly applied, for example, to oak in France, where the successive operations are shown from the top to the bottom. And the first thing that you do is to do an initial felling to prepare the stand for regeneration. You then regenerate the stand, and as the stand regenerates, then you remove the overstory as you get successful regeneration. It's quite a straightforward system, but it does, of course, rely on either natural regeneration or artificial regeneration. The second shelterwood system is the group shelterwood, and there's a purple arrow in the top left-hand part of this diagram. The group shelterwood generally works on the basis of achieving regeneration under the canopy and then opening the canopy once you've got successful regeneration to make sure it survives and grows. It doesn't usually operate as we'll see later, on the basis of making a hole in the canopy and hoping for the best. And that's an important thing. Once you've achieved regeneration, and it's on a group basis, then basically what you do is you intervene in the canopy to enlarge the size of the groups to achieve successful regeneration as we go from the top to the bottom. Okay, the third shelterwood system is the irregular shelterwood system, and this has elements of uniform and group systems in it. But the distinguishing feature with an irregular system is that the period of regeneration is very long, and that leads to a much more diverse crop, as shown in diagram E at the bottom of this slide. So that can be one way, a midway point to transformation to a selection system. And that leads us rather nicely into the selection system, which, as we all know, has a mixture of young trees, medium-sized trees, and large trees, either arranged in single trees or in groups, depending on what type of selection system you have. And the key thing about that is that felling and regeneration operate on the whole of the area. That's the distinguishing feature of a selection system. And just saying a little bit about application, there are a large number of examples now in the UK. Certainly, really since the 1950s, we've been trying these systems, and now there's lots and lots of examples of people using shelterwood systems, selection systems, group systems in their attempts to diversify their approaches to silviculture. There's an example here of Douglas fir at Longleat, where there's a mixture of uniform and group systems, and often they work together. This is an example from a research area that we've got in northeast Wales, at Clocainog. This is supposed to be an irregular shelterwood system, and that raises some questions. We could talk about that quite a lot, but the whole of the area is showing how successful you can be using some of these silvicultural systems, even with Sitka spruce. It's really quite uplifting walking around that area. And then down into the lowlands, we've got an example here of application of what was described to me as a group selection system, and here they'd taken in my view, a slightly wrong approach in that they'd created a gap which had then filled up with rather difficult weeds to deal with, and there wasn't really very much regeneration, which really goes back to that point that I made earlier. And also it was described as a selection system, and I'm really not sure about whether or not that terminology is correct for this particular woodland. Okay, and we haven't talked very much about strip systems. Strip systems are a focus of some of our work now, but they can be usefully used to manage forests in this country. And there's an example here from southern Scotland. Okay, well, the first take-home message then, and a review of that, is that I've looked at different silvicultural systems being applied around the country, and I sometimes think that some of the communication can be a little bit difficult. Sometimes people are trying to apply silvicultural systems and they're not quite clear what system they're trying to use. And I've often asked my question, I wonder if it actually makes any difference. Because really in the application of a lot of silvicultural systems to establish woodlands, there's a very clear take-home message. And the take-home message is keep thinning, control the deer, and create diversity. And if you're doing those three things, and you continue to work with the dynamics of the woodland, you're very, very likely to be successful. And sometimes it doesn't matter if you're doing a group shelterwood, a uniform, or a selection system. Just keep thinning, control the deer, and create diversity. And I think that is the level of communication for effective forest practices, certainly during the transformation stage. Anyway, we can discuss that at the end of the webinar. Okay, so the first cheeky question then, what is the main difference between a shelter wood and a selection system? A, in a shelter wood, trees are regenerated under a canopy. B, harvesting and extraction are much more difficult in selection systems. C, in a selection system, felling and regeneration are continuous over the whole area. Or D, it doesn't matter because there are few, if any, selection systems in the UK. So write down on a piece of paper which of A, B, C, or D you think is the right answer to the question. Okay, if everybody's done that now, if you've been listening carefully, the answer is C. In a selection system, felling and regeneration are continuous over the whole area. That's not true. It's not a selection system, and there really aren't many in the UK if you apply that criteria rigorously. So D is actually right as well, but it's not the answer to the question. Okay, so that really just reminds us about this decision tree, and the key thing there is the question at the top. Is felling and regeneration A, concentrated, or B, continuous over the whole area? And if it is B, then it's a selection system. Okay, so just now linking up to giving a bit of a summary of that. If we're using alternatives to clear felling, this generally means we're maintaining canopy cover. Regeneration is happening in a sheltered environment. There's a commitment to thinning, that's important. That's one of the bits of the take-home message. We need to utilize natural regeneration if we can. And generally, if we're going through a process of transformation, species diversity can increase. And often that's a legitimate aim of transformation, which can lead to much more resilient woodlands, which is a good thing. Now, just linking in with the second part of the talk, which is about climate change. Of course, climate change will affect stands being managed using continuous cover in very different ways if they're A, in transformation, or if they're a simple structure, that's 1 or 2 canopy strata, maybe you're using a shelter wood for that, or complex, there's 3 or more canopy strata, maybe using a selection system. So climate change will affect those 3 different types of woodland very differently. Excuse me. Now, I won't talk about the basics of climate change overly. We all know that basically the projections are for increased temperature, more stormy conditions, and very different distributions of rainfall going into the future. And what Victoria and I did in this piece of work was that we did a literature review of all the evidence that we could find on the big question of how continuous cover can help forests adapt to climate change. And the sort of the main things that we found out was that there was a lot of literature that had been written on climate change. There was a lot of literature that had been written on continuous cover, but there weren't that many examples of pieces of scientific literature where there had been direct comparison of different silvicultural systems in terms of the parameters of climate change. The second thing that we found was that there's a huge amount of uncertainty, A, in climate change, and B, in the application of a continuous cover. So that made the exercise quite difficult. And as I've already said, climate change implications will be quite different for transformation or simple or complex stands. But the way in which we approached the review was that we identified primary and secondary risks. And the primary risks are basically whereby factors of the climate directly affect the woodland. Secondary risks were the ones that were as a result of ecological functioning or some other interaction between the forest and the climate. And we identified 5 primary risks, which are listed in this slide. The first was about strong storms. The second was about heavy winter rainfall. The next was about growth rates due to increased carbon dioxide. The next one was about increased temperatures and incidence of drought. And then the last one is about reduced incidence and changed timing of frost. And what I'm going to do is to give a very brief review, a very brief summary of what our findings were. But there is a written report on this, which goes into an awful lot more detail. So we'll just take them one at a time. The first one is about increased incidence of strong storms. And Bill, the CCFG chair, needs to be complimented because he did a really good piece of work, which was one of the primary sources of evidence that we used in our review. And this paper is listed in this slide. And this is basically going to be the way in which I report on each of the risks. What we've done is to rate the potential impact of the risk and then talk about and then summarize the evidence that we found in terms of the effect of using ATC, continuous cover, different silvicultural systems. And then importantly, we've also given a rating for the evidence base, because that, as I said at the start, sometimes there was very, very little written information or very few actual scientific comparisons to go on. So the first one about increased incidence of strong storms, the potential impact rating was high. On balance, we felt that the effect of using ATC could be neutral or positive. And the one rider to that was that stands in transformation can actually be more vulnerable to wind damage because of changes in thinning practice and the lack of compensatory growth in the stability of the trees during the transformation. So you do have to be careful for those. But generally, for mature stands being managed using shelter wood or selection systems, that it's either neutral or positive. And the evidence base for that, thanks to Bill and other papers, was good. The second risk was about increased incidence of heavy winter rainfall. Now, of course, this has a very dramatic effect on particular sites. But of course, heavy winter rainfall can also not just affect the site directly, it can affect flooding off the site, and heavy rainfall can also increase surface runoff and cause acidification. So we tried to look at all those aspects. And it's sort of like, although there wasn't that much scientific literature on the subject, it seems fairly intuitive that if you have a canopy on a piece of woodland, and that is intercepting some of the power of the heavy rainfall, then that can have a positive effect. But as I said, the evidence base was only moderate, and the one rider to this was that we didn't find any evidence at all that the use of continuous cover could in any way change the frequency of or the size, the weight of flooding further down the catchment. The third risk is about changing growth rates due to increased carbon dioxide. And I think most people on the call will know about this. But in terms of continuous cover, basically, although this is potentially a benefit for forests, some of the species will grow quicker and produce more timber. Or in terms of whether or not CCF actually has any dramatic effects on the speed with which they grow, it seems to be fairly neutral. And the evidence base for that was good because there's been some quite good modelling work done particularly on ponderosa pine by Kevin O'Hara and Linda Nagel, working in the west coast of the USA. The fourth risk is about increased temperatures and incidence of drought. And this was one of the most difficult risks to deal with in the review. The reason for that is that, of course, if you basically start intervening in the canopy, you are likely to be, and then regenerating it, you will be shading those trees which are regenerating. But of course, the canopy is also using water. So the complexity of temperature, water, and shading is a very, very complex one. And we weren't helped by the fact that in terms of CCF, there weren't any really very good studies on that. But of course, in conditions of very severe droughts, there can be very clear potential benefits for continuous cover. But generally, we thought the impact of this was medium, but the effect of using ATC, really, it's very difficult because of the complexity of different sites and different species, different management. It is difficult to quantify, and there was a very poor evidence base. However, that's not the case for the last one, which is really about reduced incidence and change timing of frosts. This is a direct risk, obviously, from climate change. And generally, although the potential impact was low, there is a good evidence base for this. The effect of using ATC and sheltering from frost is positive. And many of us will have seen examples of that in UK forestry. So basically, as a summary for all of these things, there can be potentially positive benefits for using certain types of continuous cover for helping to adapt forests to climate change, but it's not a panacea. You have to be quite careful. Okay, and so really the sort of we're getting into possibly one of the other take-home messages. It may be that when we're trying to apply CCF to different forests, we consider at the landscape scale, and what we try to do is to introduce different silvicultural systems at different scales within the landscape as a way of trying to adapt the forest to climate change, rather than just make wholesale changes. That seems a much better approach. Okay, so the last second cheeky question that I'm going to ask is, in summary, do alternatives to clear felling offer any potential for adapting forests to climate change? Yes. A, yes, the evidence is clear. We should stop clear felling. B, no, the evidence is unclear. We should retain clear felling as the default option. C, yes, there are some benefits if the species site contexts are conducive to application. D, yes, there are some benefits, and 25% of all forests should be managed using alternatives to clear fell or continuous cover. So write down on a piece of paper which of those you think is correct. Okay, so the winner again is answer C. I seem to like the answer C in these multiple choices. You'll have noticed that. So yes, there are some benefits if the species site context are conducive to application. Okay, so that's really the end of we're beginning to move to the end of the webinar, and I wanted to give you some take-home messages. And the first take-home message I've already talked about a little bit, and that is that I think sometimes that our language to do with transformation to continuous cover, some of the sort of like academic articles and practical articles being a bit self-critical of some of the things even perhaps I've written, on a stand-by-stand basis, it's actually quite straightforward. What you need to do is to keep thinning, control the deer, and create diversity. And if I can give another take-home message, just to reinforce the take-home message, At the landscape scale, it's almost the same. What you need to do on the whole landscape is to keep thinning, control the deer, and create diversity, but this time not at the stand scale, but at the landscape scale. Okay, thanks for your attention.
Right. Thank you, Gary. Do you want to stop sharing?
Yes.
And then everyone can see you. Now, I did have a question that I'm not sure whether to start with, give Graham Gill the floor, because he's opened with a philosophical question. Graham, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, I've been talking about silvicultural systems. Does CCF describe a range of silvicultural systems, or is it a form of forest management, or is it a philosophy?
Okay, well, that's a good question. I mean, my answer to that is that continuous cover, it's really an approach to forest management. But what I'm trying to do in terms of simplifying my message is I'm trying to encourage people not to worry about the philosophy of it. What they should do is just get on and try it and learn about how their woodlands respond to thinning, controlling the deer, and trying to create diversity. And as a process over a number of decades, I think that's a good starting point. But thanks for the question. I hope that's answered it.
Graham, do you want to pick up at all, or you?
Yeah, I think it's not really equivalent to alternatives to clear fell, because it's rather a wider thing, and I think it's more a form of forest management than just a particular set of silvicultural systems.
Fair point.
Okay, now Ruth Alexander's got a question. Ruth, do you want to unmute, or do you want me to ask the question?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to unmute. Yeah, I'm just really interested in the most future-proof species mixes, and I'm not clear at this stage how much thought we need to be giving to species that are native to warmer climates in terms of climate matching, as opposed to focusing solely on species native to Scotland, where I am at the moment.
Yeah, that's I mean, a lot of that, Ruth, is about your objectives of management. I think on some sites where, for instance, conservation can be a very high priority, that sort of almost takes you towards the native species. I think on some other sites, you can contemplate, other species outside the native range. And obviously, there's been a whole history of that in forestry in the UK. And, we have to look for different provenances, both within our native species to increase our resilience, and also consider different provenances, perhaps for some of our the non-native species. But the one most important thing that I would like to say about species mixtures is that we have come up in forest research with this idea of compatibility scores for matching different trees in mixtures to try and make sure that the mixtures are robust and can get through to the first thinning. And there's quite a nice paper in the Quarterly Journal of Forestry which explains that approach, because one of the other things that I've seen is totally inappropriate intermixtures of species which are being planted in the UK. And sometimes, the sort of the faster growing light demanding species which totally dominate the mixture. So what we need is a much more planned approach to the development of creating new mixed species stands.
Great, thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you, Ruth. Now, there are two questions that I think are kind of linked. One is a comment from Jackie Dunn, which I'm going to tie in a question of my own. And of John Burgess's. And it goes back to the thinning control deer, and Jackie's version had been to control grey squirrels as well as deer.
I don't disagree.
And then John has added the question, when you mean diversity, are you talking species, structural, genetic, age, or all of the above in some measure?
All of the above in some measure. I mean, if you're trying to do continuous cover, then that almost means that you're ticking the structural box. So it's really the other boxes, and they relate basically to species and also to consider of genotypes. So those are the things that forest management can influence, as well, obviously, as the structural one. So if you start on this journey of continuous cover, almost immediately, because of natural regeneration, if you're in a sort of reasonably diverse forest environment, you're likely to get more species into your species mix. But there's also the possibility of introducing different genotypes by planting, and both of those approaches are commendable.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Now let's go back to Johnny Holson's question. Johnny, do you want to unmute and ask, or do you want me to ask this for you?
Thanks, Bill, and hi, Gary. Fantastic.
Hi.
Fantastic presentation. Thank you. Just a question to see if a couple of weeks ago at the Forest Europe high-level talks in Berlin, the state forestry directors from Germany and Switzerland and Spain stated their immediate financial support for conversion of monocultures to close to nature forestry, allocating 200 million euros per year in response to the science of the vulnerabilities of climate change and the spruce bark beetle in Europe.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether the UK government might take this on board, and there might be ripple effects in the UK. Could you see this financial support coming our way?
I think there's a distinct possibility of that. It's quite interesting, actually. In a lot of my dealings with forestry consultants up and down the country, they're increasingly making the case for using continuous cover on a financial basis to owners. And one of the main reasons for that is the very large density of deer that we have, and also grey squirrels. But if you clear fallow crop, the costs that you have to go through to regenerate that area are very, very significant. And continuous cover, although you do need to control the deer, as I hope I made clear, it means that you don't have to go through that high-risk environment. And if you're an owner, there can be very, very significant benefits for doing that. So yes, I don't see why not. And public money, there have been examples already of public money being put towards encouraging increased use of continuous cover.
Thank you, Gary. There's a question in the chat. You're illuminated now.
Yes, it got rather dark rather quickly.
And there's a question from Joe, which I'll ask for him. How do you see CCF being adopted at a larger scale? And questions of the economics of continual management. And a point that I was going to raise with you, as well as the lack of workers available to carry out the appropriate thinning regimes. Is there a training need hidden in some of this that we need to address?
Yeah, well, there's two questions there. One is about training, and the other thing is about scale. So, I mean, there's a very, very clear training need, and it's not just amongst professionals, but it's basically got to be vertically integrated. And my experience is that, even the most traditional forest craftspeople working on estates, once they understand what you're trying to achieve in terms of using continuous cover, they can really embrace it. In some ways, it increases the pride of the job. The thing about scale is really not if you're starting out on this journey, is to start where you think it will work. And there's a very good example. I showed one picture from Clerkennog. In Clerkennog Forest, Bill and I and Bangor have developed quite a long-term relationship there. And over about a 25-year period, it's basically gone from, this is all very new and we only want to do it in one particular research area, which I showed a picture from. And that basically has led to actually most of the 4,000 hectares of Clerkennog Forest being managed using some form of continuous cover. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And a lot of that has been done because of the financial argument. Some of it is because of conservation of red squirrels as well. But yeah, I wouldn't worry about scale to begin with. I would start small and make sure that you know how to work it. And then I think as soon as you've developed good systems and things like that, it'll probably roll out reasonably well to a fair scale.
Okay, thank you. Miles Drury's got a question which I think ties into that. Miles, did you want to unmute and ask Gary? Or shall I do it for you?
If that's come off. Yeah, thanks.
Hello, Miles.
Hello, Gary. Hello. I was going to ask, given sort of the legacy of the variability of the stand structures and sizes that we've got in the UK, would you advocate limiting a size, any given intervention of clear felling, assuming that in the next rotation we're trying to promote some alternative to clear felling?
I'm a bit sanguine about that. I don't like all this sort of limiting what people can do because things are incredibly, forest managers don't need their hands tied any more than they already are by the framework within which they work. And I certainly know that when we wrote the guidance on managing native broadleaf woodland, we varied the size of the sort of like the felling areas to such an extent that some of them are actually clear fells as defined by, the UCWAS and the forestry standard. But basically, if you're dealing with light demanding tree species, you sometimes need much bigger areas to deal on. So I wouldn't be in favour of defining a sort of maximum size for application.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Cheers.
Gary, I'll ask a question if I may.
Please do.
And it's to go back to the keep thinning. And I suppose the question is, there is a risk on certain sites if thinning is done without due care and attention, you lose the site to regeneration. So would you like to sort of expand on how you think the thinning should be done or what factors might be taken into consideration?
Well, obviously, there are very specific conditions where, sort of like where that very broad guidance needs to be qualified. That in saying that, what I'm trying to do is to get more thinning done. I've often thought about writing a book about sort of like an introduction to forestry, and the sort of like the first thing that I'd put is that just walk into any woodland and say, oh, this needs thinning, and it's almost true. Any woodland that you go to in the UK, it's generally overstocked, and sort of like overstocked woodlands and high basal areas are not conducive to continuous cover. So I completely take the point that there are certain situations where you can start getting into a mess, particularly with wind. But as a general idea, I think it's sound.
Okay. And now Brian Elliott's comment. Brian, do you want to unmute and give Gary your comment?
Yeah, hi Gary.
Hello. Hi, Brian.
I'm quite keen on this, on managing light structures within a woodland, and I've been using group shelterwoods throughout UK, and it seems to work quite well. Just not been not being too prescriptive, but looking at different ways of fitting into the landscape.
Right.
Critical aspect, and making sure that we don't get blown away by 3 different views of wind seems to hit us.
Great. It sounds like you found things that work and you're going with it, and that's the thing to do. That's what I'm trying to encourage people to do. Is to go out and try things, and learn from the experience. And thinning, deer control, and diversity are the things to concentrate on.
You know, I've found that different species have got different requirements in terms of light and all sorts of aspects. So it's fitting species and landform into a structure that works.
And sort of like, you know, it sounds like you're on the advanced course. A lot of people, those sorts of things, it can be quite frightening and sort of, oh, I don't want to go down that route. But there's no reason why they shouldn't, because you just learn it in the inherent response of your woodland to the operations that you carry out and your observations.
Yep.
Good.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks, Gary. Jackie Dunn has sort of opened up another area that I think we've not really touched on.
Good.
Which relates to timber marketing, its management. Jackie, do you want to unmute and ask Gary the point you were going to raise?
Hi, Gary.
Hi, Jackie.
Hi, speaking to you from the depths of a very windy Cumbria tonight.
Oh, lovely. I'm envious.
What I find with any kind of alternative selection system is really that the amount of time required to do the timber marketing, it's much more intense. And if I had perhaps 5 estates to look after in total, and they would pay me all that delicious time to do that, that would be really great. But I have a lot more to do, you know, keep things happening. And I find it very difficult to change around and do that intensive marketing. And I'm not sure up here in the north, we're totally ready for that intensive marketing. And yet, believe it or not, about 20 years ago, I used to run the timber marketing group. Don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, I do.
But, I feel we've lost that. We've lost a little bit of that, looking and expanding and working with different markets. It's really interesting to get your feel. You might, down south, they might be a little bit better.
Yeah. I mean, what specific aspect is it, Jackie, that takes the time? Is it the fact that you're producing a greater variety of sizes and pole lengths? Because of the structures that the material's coming out of, and is it a question of small scale and therefore causing difficulties? What's
well?
The specific
I think it's more that when I'm thinking of trying to do that kind of system, and I have to say I've had some failures, quite catastrophic after Storm Arwen as well. But I have given them a try, and then I've adapted after Storm Arwen. But yeah, effectively, you've potentially got lots of different markets that you're trying to hit within one stand. And it's finding the contractor buyer scenario. Personally, I like selling my timber standing because it works better for me and how I interact and manage.
Sure.
And I think for standing, it's more difficult. If you're selling at roadside and you can put that time into keeping those different markets at the end of your fingertips, because that takes some time as well. So I think that whole ramification is quite different.
No, I think that's really valuable experience, Jackie. And this conversation about continuous cover, we're all learning, and I've learned something from what you've said. So yeah, I mean, I don't really have an answer from that, because it's sort of like, obviously you've got some very good experience there, and sort of like the number of markets that are available is different in different regions of the UK.
Yeah.
So that that's probably part of it.
I think one thing we can always probably rely on is if we've grown some good timber and good saw log timber, we can always sell that, and we can always get rid of the chip. So So hopefully it will go.
I think it's become marginally easier than 30 years ago to get rid of the smaller sizes.
Yes,
but,
it definitely has. Yeah, yeah.
If I'm up in the Lake District, Jackie, I'd love to come and see what you're doing.
Absolutely, do. I would, yeah, please do. I would love to take you to some of my estates. And I do across the north as well, a lot in North Yorkshire. So.
Cool, right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jackie.
Cheers, Jackie.
Gary, we're, I think, coming to a close. I'd like to come back to your 3 messages. So keep thinning, control deer, squirrels, create diversity. In most situations you've dealt with in your career, which of these do you think is the most difficult to persuade owners and managers to undertake?
It's got to be deer. You know, there's sort of like there's and sometimes it's not about the individual owner or the particular forest that you deal with, because it's landscape scale. And even if you do it, and your neighbours don't, then you can be in trouble. So you know, I think I think it's got to be it's got to be first deer, second thinning, and sort of like trying to seek generally lower basal areas than we've been used to in the past, and then third, I think most people understand diversity and the different elements of species, size and genotype. So I think that's a less difficult message, although I do sometimes think that some people think that climate change adaptation is only about changing species, and that, you know, that's not, you know, silviculturally that's not the case. There are other very good options. Sorry, I've started waffling a bit.
No, that's fine. It's useful to get your spin.
But yeah, no, the controlling deer would be the one, but it's not necessarily the problem of the individual owner stroke manager. It can be a neighbour stroke landscape problem.
Yeah, okay. So in a way, what you're saying to they have to be sure that they've got this element of the ecosystem under control before they embark on the thinning, and if they can do the thinning and they've controlled the browsing, the diversity will almost diversity will follow almost as a consequence.
Yeah, in most environments, I'm sure you're aware of, you know, some of these, particularly on these harsh upland sites where you might get a little bit of rowan or something like that coming in. But if you're in a fecund environment in the lowlands of Scotland, Wales, England, Northern Ireland, and there's a few tree species around and some that you don't know about, generally they'll start regenerating.
Okay, we've got another couple of questions that come in, and one I think is a good one for towards the end. Charlie Taylor's posed this. Charlie, do you want to unmute and ask?
Yeah, Bill, can you hear me?
Yeah, good, loud and clear. Hi, Charlie.
Hello, Gary. Glad you've retired.
Doesn't feel like it, but
no, well, it doesn't actually. Anyway, a number of folk have commented on training. It's really important, and obviously if folk get training and consolidate, that breeds confidence. But for me, leadership is also key to giving folk a license to operate and to take things on. And just what are your thoughts on that issue and the current status of leadership across Britain in relation to this type of management?
Well, I agree. I certainly agree with your views about training and things like that. And you know, so I think there has been leadership. I mean, the Continuous Cover Forestry Group has played a really leading role in that. And there are these people who you know, are very experienced in different parts of the country that, you know, go to these field meetings and can provide leadership. So I think there's a network of people that can provide that. There could be more, and maybe in 20 years' time there will be more. Yeah, I mean, there's been different fora for that continuous cover forestry group, and the Royal Forestry Society meetings and the ICF. So yeah, I think it's been pretty good actually.
Bill, if I could just come back on that. I mean,
Yeah, surely on you go.
I agree with that, Bill, Gary. In terms of peer, there's lots of good peers out there.
Yeah.
When I mention leadership, I'm thinking of folk that actually lead the large organisations, either be state or private. And I don't get a sense that many of them are hefted to driving this sort of management forward. And without that sort of drive and commitment, it will happen in areas like Clough-Einleigh you've mentioned, and other areas around the country, and lots of private states. But it won't actually take a grip as being something that we do on a wider scale.
That's that may be the case. Sort of like it would be, if I was leading a big forestry organization, the sorts of things that would drive me are things like, climate change adaptation and things like that. And I'd be wanting to push those as organizational priorities. And I would want my professional team to say, well, the way in which you can do that is using A, B, and C. So, sometimes it's linking up those leadership aspirations with the way in which you can do it. And then you will have experienced this, Charlie, actually changing the processes, policies, and procedures in the organization to facilitate that, because that can be really difficult sometimes. Some people, like Jackie was talking about, the changes that are required in marketing. And sometimes these things just need a little bit of time.
Alec Dauncey was sort of commenting on the chat on this.
I'm not looking at the chat, actually. I'm just trying to answer.
No, that's all right. I'm doing that for you. Alec, do you want to come in?
Yes, thanks, Bill. Yeah, I was, I know we often think, do we need skills? Do we need training? Is it more complicated? Is it management intensive? But I really like your keep thinning, control deer, and create diversity. And it seems to me that we already have the skills for that, and we really want to be empowering people to get out and do it. And while I've got the microphone, I'd like to agree completely with Charlie about leadership at sort of higher levels in organizations. Thanks.
Gary, do you want to come back on that at all?
Yeah, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have people that are expert silviculturalists that do understand the difference between these systems and things like that. I think that is important, but it's this sort of like messaging, and sometimes I've been reading some of the different types of articles that have been produced by different people using different words for almost the same principles in terms of stand management. I sort of thought if I was coming to this fresh, it would confuse me a bit. And confidence is key.
I wonder whether I should at this point, Gary won't have seen this, but I think Louise Page made a comment earlier on in the chat, which I think is quite relevant to what you just said. Louise, are you still on? And if so, do you want to unmute?
She hasn't got a mic. Oh, that's a shame.
Yeah.
Hello, Louise.
Louise's comment is along the lines, people will probably read it when this goes out on YouTube.
Okay.
Where she says a silvicultural system, she is not chosen but formulated as a solution to a specific set of circumstances. And treatments are devised to fit the circumstances, and the naming of them is done afterwards. In other words, the terminology describes treatment, it does not dictate it. And the silvicultural is based on, I'm paraphrasing here, system is based on a working hypothesis and is altered through adaptive management over time.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite a bit in what you're saying, that we can be, and what Alec was saying is that we can be too prescriptive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. And, you know, that sort of, like Herefordshire, beautiful, fertile, you know, red loamy soil with trees on it, and you know, taking the canopy off, and you know, we're using group selection here. Let's clear some holes in the canopy, and it just creates problems. And I think that's an example whereby you're trying to conform to a system rather than actually going with the dynamics of the forest.
Okay, I think we've gone 5. And we've had a good round of questions and put you on the spot, hopefully a few times, Gary.
You have.
And so I'd like to thank you for the presentation and for engaging so much with the audience. I'd like to thank the audience for all the questions. If you want to catch up with the webinar, it should be on our YouTube channel in a few days' time. And also to say that this will be the last webinar before Christmas, but we'll be resuming shortly in the new year, so please watch this space. And on behalf of the group, it's probably not too early to say this, wish you all the best for Christmas and the new year. And Gary, thanks ever so much for making time.
Yeah, well, thanks for putting up with me and a great range of questions. So thank you very much.
Cheers, Gary.